afternoon, and welcome to this week's edition of 2-Minute Warning, a feature interview with Bill Spindle, Council on Foreign Relations, International Affairs Fellow in India. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks, Sean. Good to be here.
Very, very clean shaven for a guy who's wandering the streets of India. There must be lots of hot water around, lots of energy around.
There is here. I'm in Kolkata at the moment, and yes, lots of energy here. Staying in the old city, but I just got off a week of traveling in the Sundarbans in the sort of mangrove area, looking at sort of climate impacts and that sort of thing down there. We can talk a little bit about that. It was super interesting.
Well, I was just sort of kick off on the news of the day, so to speak. Of course, everything Ukraine, everything Russia's invasion into Ukraine. And I very much enjoyed the article you wrote asking the question, climate change couldn't be further from Putin's mind, or could it? A sort of that caveat of a question, if indeed it's part of this overarching equation. I'd welcome a bit of a deeper dive into your thinking there. Could it be?
Sure. Oh, well, sure. First, I caveat all that by, of course, saying that I have no inside information about what's going on in Putin's mind or his inner circle, so as small as it probably is. And I would also say that I don't think that climate is at the forefront of his mind by any stretch of the imagination. I think things like missiles in missile batteries going into Poland are a lot more foremost in his mind in terms of the timing of this sort of thing, as well as a lot of other stuff. So it's a background issue, if anything. But I thought it was worth raising the question because, big petrostates are thinking about this now. They're thinking about climate and what it means, and energy transition and what it means for them. You're seeing that in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, where these big producers are, even as they're planning to produce more oil, they're also thinking about how they're going to transform their societies. Because what's going to happen, I think they see something that a lot of people aren't quite realizing. What they see is that in the short term, how many years? I don't know, 2, 5, 10, they're going to see the West is going to probably tail off on some of its production. They're going to be able to keep up, probably expand production. So they may see a kind of last golden age of rising prices and rising volumes. And but after that, I think they're smart enough to see that whenever that ends, and again, who knows, 5, 10 years, whenever it is, this is going to peak. And oil markets, like many energy markets, operate on the margins. It's not going to take that much of a decline in demand to put them into a world of hurt where they are seeing falling prices and falling volumes. And at that point, it's really too late for them to adjust. That's why you're starting to see UAE, Saudi doing things. And I don't think it's crazy to think that Putin might have thought himself, among other reasons why I might want to do this, it might be good to get going on my project of establishing a new Russian empire, if that's what he's up to. It's just a question to raise.
Well, I certainly think it's a question worth raising in the context of the timing, in the sense that he had to, as was reported, that he has been planning this for a while, getting his balance sheet in order, getting all of the different pieces in order, that the timing of the energy crisis in Europe, the sort of gas shortages and coal shortages, and in Asia, the elevated price of commodities perhaps gave him the timing, and they are largely due, at least from a certain body of thinking, that the elevated prices have been, at least in Europe, due, and to a certain extent in Asia, given the underinvestment, but that due to underinvestment and too fast or an accelerated commitment or narrative towards the transition. I wonder how much does underinvestment play into that, do you think, that delivering dislocations and this timing at this time elevating the price of everything prior to the invasion?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right about the timing issue, and I think it's really, that's what it's about. Is it part of the timing at the end of the day? But I would say there's a bigger issue, and that's really what I kind of wanted to make the point when I wrote that column was, The bigger issue is that lurking behind a lot of things that are beginning to happen in the world, geopolitical shifts, even energy transition shifts, is climate change. And it's not that obvious, and it's often very hard to tease out, what part of this is climate change as opposed to human mismanagement or geopolitics or everything else that's going on in the world. And yet there is this, and increasingly will be, this undertow from climate that's going to drive a lot of things that go on in the world. I can remember when I was in Syria prior to the Arab uprisings, and I went to the suburbs of Damascus where thousands and thousands of people had poured in from the northern parts of Syria, which was suffering a massive drought, mainly caused by mismanagement, mainly caused by the terrible treatment that the Kurds get from the Syrian government. However, climate definitely was playing a role in that. That's clear. Scientists have studied that now. And that, it was those very suburbs that erupted and caused Syria's big uprising. So what role did climate play in that? Surely some. Wasn't the only factor. And I think that's the same sort of thing you're looking at.
And the timing here as well is relevant to the sort of the analysis and the political posturing in the midst of this Ukraine-Russia crisis is, will this set back the energy transition by X number of years, or will indeed it accelerate? We had the German chancellor overnight saying that they're going to push all the levers to be completely net zero neutral by 2035. What's your own view on the impact of this major crisis I think at this moment of where transition was really coming to the fore?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that is pretty obvious, to me at least, given how much people are debating it. The answer is, in the short term, it's going to slow it down and make it difficult. But in the medium and longer term, it's almost certainly going to speed it up. Energy transition, how much is it before the invasion of Russia, which threw a whole new,
Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
I mean, yes, but sorry,
yes.
But before that, you had a lot of turmoil in the energy markets in Europe. What was causing that? Well, energy transition. Some of it, maybe, for sure. I mean, I'm sure Germany, even more so, is probably wondering whether it was smart to get rid of all of its nuclear plants, even as it was trying to get rid of coal at the same time. But larger things were going on here, and this goes back to this underinvestment question. You raised. To what sense is underinvestment in oil and gas production a part of this? Well, there's certainly underproduction, particularly among the sort of international oil companies as opposed to the big state petrostates. Why is that? Well, is some of it climate related, energy transition related? Perhaps, yes. I think they're thinking about that. But I'd name a couple of other factors I'd call a lot bigger, which would be the roller coaster that COVID has put global economies on. First down into the sewer, and then now racing back at sort of record pace, and the production can't keep up that fast, even shale production. And that would be the other thing I would point to is, investors lost hundreds of trillions of dollars investing in shale. They got sick of losing that money, and they told those companies, you're not getting any more money until you provide us some return. So that's what those companies have been working on. They've been suppressing production in order to pay their investors. That's going to change now with oil at the rate it is, and you're definitely going to see shale come roaring back if it stays around these levels.
Especially if you see the majors, as we have seen in the last few days, announcing their withdrawal from their Russian investments, which of course is quite critical, not for the immediate term, but certainly for the mid to longer term ability of those Russian reservoirs to extract maximum efficiency, maximum return. But I want to get into India a little bit, Bill. Of course, you're in India. You're there at the moment doing a big reporting assignment on the big energy transition in India. Even if you're clean shaven, I know that's what you're doing. But the question I have ultimately, let's just kick off with the decision India made last week to abstain from the UN Security Council vote on the draft resolution, with the text sort of deploring the strongest terms against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm wondering, what does that tell us about India at this time? What does it tell us about how much India still remains a major oil economy, and in that very heavily interwoven and dependent on Russia?
It definitely remains a country very dependent on fossil fuels, oil prominent among them, coal as well. I think the decision to sustain probably has more to do with overall security than energy security per se. India's had a long relationship with Russia that it feels like it wants very much to retain for a number of reasons. They've bought many weapon systems from them that need maintenance and repair and upgrading. Russia's a significant investor in India, and they see it as a counterbalance to China. So I think that probably explains their reluctance to go against Russia. Now, they may find themselves boxed in at some point and having to choose, in which case they would undoubtedly choose the U.S. and the West. Their relationship with the U.S. is expanding by leaps and bounds, far faster than it is with Russia. But they'll resist that. They'll do everything they can to maintain that relationship they've got with Russia.
It does strike me, that sort of point you made there, that ultimately India is desperate for greater engagement with the West. And for all the reasons that they may have abstained on this particular point, and I know the list is probably long and complicated, but hey, look at me here. I mean, the West, if there's one thing you might criticize the Europe and the West about the situation in Ukraine, is that they were in some regards perhaps too slow in absorbing this aspiring democracy into the European fold. And in some ways, we've been slow to absorb India into the global democratic fold. Your thoughts on that complicated sense of India's desperation to be more included, embedded into the Western alliance, particularly with obviously the continued rise of China and the China-Russia axis?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it desperation. I think India sees a huge advantage and sees that its future as a democracy, as an open liberal economy, lies with the West, and it's cultivating those ties increasingly in the security realm with the Quad arrangement they've got with Australia and Japan and the U.S. So they're going to move in that direction, and I think that's pretty clear. Even as they try to keep up relations with Russia and some other places that the U.S. perhaps would not be totally thrilled with, but that's the way India's always been independent. But it's working a much closer relationship with the U.S. And I think that's where we get back to sort of energy issues and energy transition issues, is that India, it's got a huge opportunity to become a leader in this new transition economies that are being built. Going back to whether this Ukraine stuff is going to cause the rise in oil prices causes a short or long-term incentives. In the short term, yeah, India would love to see more oil produced because the price is really high right now. But longer term, believe me, the incentives are only being reinforced, that they only benefit by getting their economies off oil eventually. Now, that's not easy. We're going to need a major push with electric vehicles. That'll take time. But India is spending, at current prices, surely $250 billion a year to buy oil.
Well, it seems
they'd like nothing better than to get out of that.
Their energy transition seems to be all of the above. It's like, it's not replacement. We're still doing all this fossil fuels. We'll add to. I mean, they need all of the above. That's their transition.
Yeah, that's true. But I think what the meaning of that is changing a bit. I'd say 10 years ago, when renewable energy was pretty expensive and difficult to work with, and a big project, that meant we need lots of fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. Increasingly, I think what India is finding is that renewable energy is getting to be cheaper, and in many cases already is cheaper than even existing coal, and that importing oil is quite expensive. And so, yes, they'll do what they need to do to develop. They've made that clear. We're not going to hold back the development of our country in order to satisfy the world's needs for renewable energy. And that put them in real conflict before. But I think the incentives really are aligned here. They can save money by moving towards renewable energy. They can become more energy secure they know that that's the way they're going to move as fast as possible. Yes, to the extent they need to use coal and oil in that transition, that's what they will do. But I think increasingly they'll find ways to push this forward faster, particularly after 2030. As opposed to the developed economies, which have the capability of beginning to really reduce their dependence on fossil fuels early and soon. It's really a political will matter. India probably is going to get that going and is getting it going now, and then you'll see the real acceleration after 2030.
How can India be a credible example in the world in managing an even keel transition without compromising on energy security? They did receive a lot of sort of critical response to Modi's announcement at COP26 of a 2070 date for the net zero. Can they be credible in the transition without compromising on energy security?
Yeah, I think so. As long as they keep pushing forward like they are now. Now, doing anything of this scale, like energy transition, is difficult, especially in India. But they need to push forward doing that. And as long as they are pushing forward, I think they'll be able to make a good case that they're a leader in this, not just going along grudgingly, but really playing a leadership role. If you look at like what Reliance is doing, which is something I'll be looking at, the big giant conglomerate, oil and gas conglomerate, right? Or mainly gas and oil refining conglomerate. They have what is probably could be the largest kind of integrated renewable energy project in the world going. I mean, they're promising to spend something like $75 billion over the next 10 years building solar panel plants, building hydrogen electrolyzing plants, setting up fuel cell plants, and then using that first for their own internal operations, then broader in the Indian market, and eventually exporting. So I think India can do that. Whether they can stand out depends on what other countries do, frankly.
Well, we've seen obviously China be a leader in the technology of the energy transition, capturing also the access to the mineral wealth in Africa and elsewhere needed for the energy transition. How vulnerable does that expose India to, given the sort of fractious relationship between those two major Asian powers?
Yeah, India, like many countries, is seriously worried about its dependence on China for renewable energy technology, particularly solar. Almost all of the solar panels that are in India are made in China, as they are around the rest of the world. So they're trying to remedy that. They've got some plans and different incentives that they're using to try to push solar panel manufacturing. India has not been terribly successful in setting up manufacturing, but we'll see how they do in this realm. They just introduced a big national hydrogen development plan, which seems to be getting pretty decent reviews from people looking at it, in an effort to become a massive, really one of the major global players in the hydrogen market. So we'll see how that develops.
In terms of the kind of the bridging or that sort of partnership with the West around the transition and taking on the obligations of the Paris Accord, there was a number of years ago at the COP Climate Summit in Copenhagen, 12 years ago, I think, the commitment by the Western countries to a fund of $100 billion to help emerging economies to implement and provide financing ultimately for transition projects. Now, the West has been rather slow in putting that money in the box and making it available. How much of an obstacle is that? India has been very vocal in criticizing the West for reneging on this commitment. How big of an obstacle is that to countries like India and others that struggle to access capital for these sorts of projects?
Yeah, I think that's a huge issue that's going to be really come to a head at this next, conference of the parties, as they call them, COP27 next year in next November, or this coming November in Sharm el Sheikh. It really is a huge issue, and really, I think, will decide in many ways what role governments are going in the global kind of UN structure for dealing with it is going to play in this energy transition, whether it's going to be able to push it forward and be a driver of it, or whether it's just going to be a follower. And the big question, is the West, the developed countries promised to put up $100 billion per year for these sorts of issues. They completely failed to do that. It was supposed to happen by 2020. They failed to do it at this last COP at 2021. They've now promised that by 2023, I think it is, they'll have gone quite beyond that. But that's really just the beginning, and the key really going forward and whether this next COP can make any progress, I think it's going to boil down to two things for the developed countries, right? Can they make progress, meaningful progress, reducing emissions? Because developed countries are getting they're being hit very hard by climate change right now. And you saw this giant UN report that came out earlier this week making that point. It's happening. And I've been in some places here in India in the last 2 weeks where it is visibly, demonstrably happening. There, this area where I'm in Kolkata and the areas sort of south of it have been hit by 4 massive cyclones in the last 3 years. They can't recover from that. There's just not the people who don't have the resources to. So they're increasingly becoming resentful that they didn't cause these climate problems. These people didn't have electricity, literally did not have electricity up 5 years ago or 8 or 9 years ago in some cases. They didn't create the problem, yet they're the ones suffering from it. So they're increasingly looking to the developed world to A, get serious about cutting emissions because that's where the emissions are, and B, put up some money to help both these countries, these developed countries, make the energy transition, but also now adapt to the changing environments that they're now having to adapt to, the physical impacts of it. And then on the developing world side, I would say that if the developed world can get its act together and provide those two things, which is a major question, I think, but if it could, then I think the developing world is going to have to kind of swallow what it feels is right and begin to assure that the discussion is less about things like, quote, reparations, loss and damage. Those are words and political dynamics that these developed countries can't really operate under. They are not able to do it in a way that's framed that way. I think they are willing to do it, to provide much larger funding, but it can't be, in their minds, framed that way. But the developing world feels like it has to do that because of the situation they're in now. But I think the big thing that's changed and what people need to realize going forward and what can drive this Paris-based process forward is that this is no longer aid. It's not foreign aid that anyone's asking for. This can really be investment funds. India already has seen a huge influx of investment from Goldman Sachs, from the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, from major pension funds. And these companies, right now they're pouring billions of dollars in, but they would like to pour hundreds of billions of dollars in, and they can get a return for that.
On that point, is India receptive to that? I mean, in terms of India has always been criticized by international investors in the past, not specific to the energy or energy transition, but just a difficult place to invest.
Absolutely, and I think that remains a big question mark whether India can. I think it's trying to. It has succeeded in many ways. You saw Total Energies, for example, made a huge investment in Adani Green, in a renewable energy company here. So yes, India is going to work on that. They know they need to work on it. People really do want to invest here, so they have a lot of incentive to. Whether they will be able to, well, that's a challenge that they're going to have to work on.
Bill, if we could just wrap up with sort of the more granular on the ground, given that you are, the title of this weekly interview series is called 2 Minute Warning. And we use that title because of the doomsday clock, infamously, that we're kind of running out of time. 2 minute warning, the sports analogy, the end of the game, so to speak. I'm wondering, as you mentioned there in your area where you are now, you obviously some 2 minute warning issues there, 4 cyclones in the last few years, can't recover. Are there any other more notable observations you've made on the ground reporting there that sort of fall into that category of like you know, there's a lot of this stuff that we really need to get to, but there's examples and real tangible evidence here and there that this is really a now thing.
Yeah, well, I think India very much sees it as a now thing, both in the fact that it's experiencing the whole range of climate impacts. It is going to be one of the countries that's most impacted. Indeed, I think if you add up the number of people and the number of impacts, it's probably the country that will be the most affected by climate change in that sense. So they see it as an urgent matter. They're definitely have their energy transition underway. It's not an easy one because they have development needs too, and they don't want to, you know, their people are not going to say we'll just put off our development so that the rest of the world can keep burning up carbon. They're gonna insist that the rest of the world does, and that's where we get to those issues of the developed versus developing world, and that's the critical thing that's got to happen this year. As I think the Paris framework has worked reasonably well in being an open-ended dynamic that pushes countries to do their best, you know, as well as that gets defined. But what it's avoided is what it had before, which is a kind of zero-sum trade dynamic that always halted progress. But we're moving, you know, this clash right now that's looming between the developed and developing world over these things has the potential to bring back that sort of zero sum. We're not going to do anything until you do something. Well, we're not going to do anything until you do something mentality. And that's just, we can't, if we have that, it's going to slow the process down too much, and governments will really be a follower in this rather than leading. And it just can't happen faster. It'll still happen. This transition will happen. They normally take 100 years, these sorts of energy transitions. This one has to happen in 20, 30, 40 at the most, but it needs to start now, and it won't start now if we can't resolve some of those issues.
Well, certainly we need to wrap up this interview now, but maybe as you highlighted earlier, COP27 in Egypt in November may be a unique moment where a lot of these confluence of these issues, where the developed and the developing world will have to really sort of stand up and be counted in that, and a lot of those issues you articulated on. But listen, thank you so much, Bill Spindle, Council on Foreign Relations, International Affairs Fellow in India. Really appreciate you checking in with us, and please do so again soon.
It's been great. Thanks, John.